Hello students, today we are going to learn about the American Revolution and the main events of the American Revolution, and will also do the results of the war. So without wasting any time, let's start with the class today. Starting with the first major event, which is about the First Continental Congress. The First Continental Congress convened in Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia between September 5 and October 26, 1774. Delegates from 12 of Britain's 13 American colonies met to discuss America's future under growing British aggression. The list of the delegates included many prominent colonial leaders such as Samuel Adams and two future presidents of the United States, George Washington and John Adams. Delegates discussed boycotting British goods to establish the rights of Americans and planned for a Second Continental Congress. The representatives from the colonies met in Philadelphia to discuss their rights. Congress voted to cut off colonial trade with the Great Britain until Parliament abolished the Intolerable Acts. Congress also decided to begin training men for war, fearing war with England was inevitable. King George III and Parliament did not acknowledge or respect the request of the colonists. Across North America, colonists rose in solidarity with the people of Massachusetts. Goods arrived in Massachusetts from as far south as Georgia, and by late spring 1774, 9 of the colonies called for a Continental Congress. The colonies elected delegates to the First Continental Congress in various ways. Some delegates were elected through their representative colonies, legislature, or committees of correspondence. As for Washington, he was elected with the other Virginia delegates at the First Virginia Convention, which was called in support of Massachusetts following the passage of the Intolerable Act. When Congress convened on September 5, 1774, one of the Congress' first decisions was to endorse the Suffolk Resolves passed in Suffolk County, Massachusetts. The Suffolk Resolves ordered citizens to not obey the Intolerable Acts, to refuse imported British goods, and to raise a militia. Congress' early endorsement of the Suffolk Resolves was a clear indication of the mood and spirit in Carpenter's Hall. Furthermore, the delegates promptly began drafting and discussing the Continental Association. This would become their most important policy outcome. Virginia secured the Continental Association's delay in ending exports to Britain. Before the Continental Congress, Virginia had passed its own association that delayed ending exports to avoid hurting farmers with a sudden change in the policy. The First Continental Congress' most fateful decision was to call for a Second Continental Congress to meet the following spring. Congress intended to give Britain time to respond to the Continental Association and discuss any developments at the Second Continental Congress. Moving ahead, now we'll talk about the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which were the first military engagement of the American Revolutionary War. The battles were fought April 19, 1775. This marked the outbreak of the armed conflict between the Kingdom of Great Britain and its 13 colonies in America. In late 1774, colonial leaders adopted the Suffolk Resolves in resistance to the alteration made to the Massachusetts colonial government by the British Parliament following the Boston Tea Party. The Colonial Assembly responded by forming a patriot provisional government known as the Massachusetts Provincial Congress and calling for local militia to train for possible hostilities. The colonial government effectively controlled the colony outside of the British-controlled Boston. In response, The British government in February 1775 declared Massachusetts to be in a state of rebellion. We all know about this fact that the Britain had been very forceful and cruel to the Americans as well, and Americans wanted to have freedom from them and be ruled on their own and enjoy their independence. In this battle, around 700 British army who were regulars in Boston under Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith were given secret orders to capture and destroy colonial military supplies reportedly stored by the Massachusetts militia at Concord. Through effective intelligence and gathering, the British soldiers marched out of Boston to seize the colonists' gunpowder and firearms in Concord, Massachusetts. The colonists chose their own army. Fighting broke out in Lexington and Concord in April 1775. The colonists chose George Washington as commander-in-chief of their troops, as he was the best military person among them all and his skills were very good. And as it was the first rebellion fought by the 13 colonies against the Great Britain, it held a major role because they now wanted to give tough fight to the Great Britain. The Second Continental Congress is also one of the major events, as that was the main motive of the 13 colonies, as we already discussed about it in the First Continental Congress section. So this meet was done in the Independence Hall and began in May 1775. It was just a month after shots had been fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, and the Congress was preparing for war. They established a Continental Army and elected George Washington as commander-in-chief, but the delegates also drafted the Olive Branch Petition and sent it to King George III in hopes of reaching a peaceful resolution. The king refused to hear the petition and declared the American colonies in revolt. On June 7, 1776, Virginia Delegate Richard Henry Lee put forth the resolution for independence, resolved that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states. Voting was postponed while some of the delegates worked to convince others to support independence, but a committee of 5 men was assigned to draft a document of independence. Those 5 men were John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Sherman, and Robert R. Livingston. Jefferson did most of the work, drafting the document in his lodging at 7th and Market Street. Between July 2 and July 4, Congress argued over every word in Jefferson's draft of the Declaration, making numerous changes. On July 4, Congress voted again, this time to approve the wording of the Declaration of Independence. The Second Congress managed the colonial war effort and moved incrementally towards independence, adopting the United States Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. It clearly stated that the American colonies can be free and have their own government by raising armies, directing strategy, appointing diplomats, and making formal treaties such as the Olive Branch Petition. Now let's focus on the Declaration of Independence 1776, which was issued by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776. The 13 American colonies served their political connection to Great Britain. The Declaration summarized the colonists' motivations for seeking independence By declaring themselves an independent nation, the American colonists were able to confirm an official alliance with the government of France and obtain French assistance in the war against Great Britain. Throughout the 1760s and early 70s, the North American colonists found themselves increasingly at odds with British imperial policies regarding taxation and frontier policy. When repeated protests failed to influence British policies and instead resulted in the closing of the port of Boston and the declaration of martial law in Massachusetts, the colonial government sent delegates to Continental Congress to coordinate a colonial boycott of British goods. I hope till now you are understanding the importance of the Declaration of Independence and both the meat of the Congress. The role of Thomas Jefferson is immense in this Declaration of Independence. It has 5 parts: the preamble, the statement of human rights, charges against human rights, charges against the king and parliament, and the statement of separation and signatures. It proclaimed that all men are born equal and there are certain unalienable rights that governments should never violate. These rights include the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Please be very particular about these 3 in specific, that is, right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which was the underlying goal in the Declaration of Independence. Moving ahead to the Treaty of Paris. The 1783 Treaty of Paris established the full independence of the 13 colonies, which came to be known as the United States of America. The Crown of Great Britain recognized the United States as a separate, independent, equal, and sovereign state. It established peaceful coexistence between the governments and between citizens of the United States and the subjects of Great Britain. It also ended the state of war between Great Britain and France, the Netherlands, and Spain. Those 3 countries had taken the side of the United States in its war of independence. Hence, American Independence Day is 4th July, which is a very important day in their history. Peace of Paris, collection of treaties concluding the American Revolution and signed by the representatives of Great Britain on one side and United States, France, and Spain on the other. The Netherlands and Britain also signed a preliminary treaty on September 2, 1783 and a final separate peace on May 20, 1784. By the terms of the U.S.-Britain Treaty, Britain recognized the independence of the United States with generous boundaries to the Mississippi River but retained Canada. Access to the Newfoundland fisheries was guaranteed to Americans, and navigation of the Mississippi was to be open to both Great Britain and the United States. Creditors of neither country were to be impeded in the collection of their debt, and Congress was to recommend to the states that American loyalists be treated fairly and their confiscated property restored. To France, Britain surrendered Tobago and Senegal. Spain retained Minorca and East and West Florida. The Netherlands came off poorly. It was the tough fight by the 13 colonies against Great Britain. Hence, after the declaration of their independence, there are few results of the war. The very first is the emergence of USA, because a whole new state of the United States of America was formed. There was a written constitution which was made by them as they followed their independence and wanted to have their own governing constitution made up of laws and did not want it to be under any other rule or follow any other laws. Next is Federal Democratic Republican government, which is also a type of government which the Indian Constitution adopted by the Americans, and this states that the state should be federal, democratic, free of any foreign aggression, they mean republic, and have their own government of their choice. Next, they focused on the right to freedom of speech, press, religion, and justice, which was not possible under the Great Britain, and hence, after the Declaration of Independence, it is counted as one of the results because they considered these as the basic human rights. An elected president who will govern according to the laws, and the first elected president was George Washington, who was elected unanimously by the people of America, and the one who also fought their war by being the military general and guided them towards independence. Lastly, let's talk about George Washington, who was the first president of the United States of America. George Washington was born in Virginia in 1732, and his father was a farmer. George Washington met and married Martha Custis. She was a widow with 2 children. They lived happily at Mount Vernon, where George became a skilled farmer. He pursued 2 intervened interests: military arts and Western expansion. To this day, he is the only president to receive 100% of the Electoral College votes. He served for 8 years as the President of USA and died of throat infection on December 14, 1799. From 1759 to the outbreak of the American Revolution, Washington managed his lands around Mount Vernon and served in the Virginian House of Burgesses, married and settled there. When the Second Continental Congress assembled in Philadelphia in May 1775, Washington, one of the Virginian delegates, was elected Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. After his death, the people also kept a city named on him and is also the capital of America, called as Washington, D.C. Hence, his role was immense in the independence struggle of the Americans. I hope you understood the context in today's class and got a brief idea about one of the famous and most important revolution in the human mankind, which was of the Americans and the establishment of the United States of America. Thank you for your attention. Meet you in the next class.